Hello, this is Dr. Winkler again. We are proceeding with our lectures. Today I hope I can discuss the French Revolution and also Napoleon and his era. I believe this is our 10th lecture. Don't quote me on that one. I'll have to count a little bit more carefully next time. Well, let's see what we were talking about last time. See if I can clarify maybe some of the things which I said. We were talking about the French Revolution. Remember, the French Revolution is one of the more important events, shall we say, in modern history. It changes certain issues as far as France is concerned, but the French Revolution later, under the hands of Napoleon, will spread ideals of representation and doing away with the authority of upper classes in other nations as well. This also is a standing warning about what can go right during the revolution, on what can go wrong. There are issues that become helpful as time progresses, and there are issues, of course, that are not terribly helpful that become a standing warning. But this is an attempt, as crude as it might be, to use some enlightened ideas to have a reasonable, rational, shall we say, more moral government and more moral society. Well, we're into the brutal phase, when the Jacobins essentially take control of the Legislative Assembly in Paris. And I mentioned last time about the declaration of war against Austria in April 1792. Is this wise? And remember, my argument last time was, no, this is probably a bad idea. Peace is actually more conducive to making progress, shall we say, social and political progress than is war. Is there going to be a war? Sure, eventually. But the longer the peace can be maintained, probably the better it is for the revolution and the better it is for France. Jumping into this early was a bad idea. I talked about cavalry reform. To me, it's just, this is kind of fun. It's also kind of foolish. I don't know what was wrong with the way it was before. We are trying to be reasonable, rational, and do everything by the 10, easy to move decimals around, that kind of thing. But this is a statement, is it not? It's a statement that we are trying to really break with the past and do something quite different. Talking a little bit about Louis XVI, the King of France, during all of this. He kept a diary. And on the 14th of July, 1789, he said nothing of importance happened this day in his diary. Whoa, storming the Bastille, a big statement of the mob in Paris. In all fairness to Louis XVI, his diary was not recording issues of political importance. He's more interested in hunting. This man probably would have been a much better watchmaker. He likes mechanical devices. He likes playing with them. However, an accident of birth placed him at the head of a state. He's the wrong person at the wrong time. Yes, there are accusations that he was a little thick in the head, a little slow to understand. Well, he probably was a little slow to understand, but being unable to foresee the future, what in fact is going to happen. In reality, I'm not sure what else he could have assumed in many cases. Wrong man at the wrong time. However, he did try to get away. Remember, this is one of the reasons why why the Legislative Assembly takes a look at him and says, this guy is really against us. In June 1791, remember, he and his family had been brought back to Paris from Versailles, where they could be watched more carefully. However, they were not watched carefully enough. On the night of the shortest night of the year, like the 21st of June, Louis and his family got on their coaches and decided to leave. Now, what they were going to do was rendezvous with some troops that could escort them out of France entirely, and they could live someplace else. Well, if you're trying to run and trying to run perhaps for your life, I would think that perhaps you could go as travel as lightly as possible. Louis's wife, who is not as vicious and callous as she's sometimes been portrayed. She has to bring her hairdresser with her. I mean, after all, this is a highborn lady. Would you really want to run without having the ability to make yourself look presentable at all times? They're in a large coach. The coach is really too big. You got to have everybody in there. You got to have the wife in there. You got to have the kids. Got some daughters and a son. And they get on this thing, and it's too heavy for the roads. And going around a corner, it breaks a wheel. This slows them down. They've got to repair the wheel. The men that are waiting for them at the rendezvous location, maybe this is friend, are saying, well, they're late. Well, what shall we do? They hang around for a little while. Well, let's go into a local pub and drink a little bit and get out of the morning chill. When the king shows up, the troops aren't there to protect them, and they're recognized. I mean, it's a little challenging, shall we say, for someone in a big coach, obviously trying to act like you're middle class when you're not. It's hard for Louis to act like he's not what he is. It's hard for Marie Antoinette to act like something less than a queen. They are recognized. They are apprehended. They are brought back to Paris. And now back in Paris, they're watched ever so much more closely. Louis XVI has a son. His name is Louis. The family likes the name Louis. Sometimes he has been called Louis XVII, which is a misrepresentation because he never ruled. However, had he ruled, he would have been Louis XVII. Well, he's been raised around the family. He's been protected his entire life. Hasn't been expected to do much work. It's hard to say how much character he had developed because he didn't live long enough. However, they separated him, I guess just to be mean, from his mother and his sisters, and where he had spent virtually his entire life. Of course, they take him to another room, and it's kind of challenging for Marie Antoinette to hear his son crying. Of course, after a while, he's hanging around men, and he kind of enjoys being around them. So apparently he came accommodated, or he was able to come to grips with his situation. There's a mystery surrounding him because there's no account of his death. We know this, that after a while, he was locked up in a room by himself. For an adult, a well-adjusted adult, that kind of incarceration can be very challenging. It can be quite challenging for you mentally, among other things, physically as well. The Dauphin, that's the term for the person who should inherit the throne, the boy, Louis, couldn't handle it. Had he survived, he probably would have been mentally challenged. He could have been a mental idiot. There are all these stories, and they're kind of fun, about this Frenchman who showed up in Louisiana. No, not Louisiana. I should say the Carolinas. And later on the Americas. And he's the old Frenchman that people say, oh, he had royal leaning. And people speculate, oh, by the way, this band could have been the Dauphin. It could have been Louis XVII. That has pretty well been dismissed. Like I say, we have no account of his death. We don't know when he died, and we don't know how he died. But there's no tradition that they had the king's heart, the Dauphin's heart, in a jar. I guess it was with alcohol, so it would not rot over the many, many years. When it became possible to take DNA materials from flesh and connect that to families, then it became possible to test this heart. When the heart was tested, it was clearly the royal family. the tradition saying it was the Louis XVII's heart is probably correct. So he died. Well, do you see the kind of cruelty we have going on here? Now, I was talking last time about the trial and execution of Louis XVI, who is killed by the guillotine. Remember, that's this. Should I get a guillotine up here? I'm sure you all know what I'm talking about. Sometimes I make a very bad joke in my class. I'll ask the people, this is a bad joke. I'll ask my students, who is the most famous person in the French Revolution? And of course, my joke is this: it's Monsieur de Guillotine. It was named after a doctor, I believe, who invented this device as a mechanism, a means of killing people as rapidly and with the least amount of pain possible. It was very rapid, but I'm not going to say there was no pain involved. So this is a guillotine. Yeah, there's a weight up here, and you can see a blade that's on an angle. And when the release is pulled, the blade falls, comes down. The weight of the blade and the fact that it is angled cuts through the victim's head. This is a form of execution. It's going to be used in Europe and in other countries as well, including Germany, well into the 20th century. In fact, when Hitler is having people killed, they're not all killed this nicely. There are men strung up by piano wire, those kinds of things. But there are still people. Sometimes Hitler would call them political dissidents. You and I would call them incredibly courageous people. Were killed by the guillotine. And that's in the 1940s. So this is a form of executions involved for a lengthy period of time. Can we say one of the reasons why we have the guillotine is that the Enlightenment were arguing very strongly, you really should be awful. I said that wrong. You really shouldn't be awful. You shouldn't torture people to death, as happened to William Wallace. Yeah, we can probably say this. However, can we say there was another mistake made? This would go back to the constructive phase of the French Revolution. Remember, we're back up here with this. And that is, they probably should have done away with the death penalty. Had they done away with the death penalty and had the brutal phase not brought it back, maybe some of the horrific aspects of the brutal phase of the French Revolution could have been avoided. Any event, let's go back to Louis XVI. I told you about the trial last time. You try him, is he guilty? Yes. What's the nature of the punishment? Finally, by a very small vote, they decide to execute him. Now, let's go back and make a historic comparison. In 1649, Parliament executed King Charles I of England. He was beheaded. The guillotine was not around that time frame. So he was beheaded by a professional executioner, a guy with an axe. Put the king's head down on a block, take the axe, and sometimes they use swords, but in any case, in this case, they use an axe. Can we say that's a quick way of dying, quicker than many? Well, did this really help the Parliament? Did it really help the revolution that's going on in England? In reality, remember I mentioned that at least politically, at least as far as prestige is concerned, in killing the king, they had made themselves look awful. They had made more enemies and accomplished very little, practically nothing. It was more revenge than it was justice, shall we say. To a similar extent, does the revolution really believe in executing Louis XVI, that they're going to make political progress with this? Do they actually believe that they are going to get more loyalty from this? Or are they going to create more enmity? The enemies of France, and there are many, will look at this with distress, because this is what the French Revolution means. It doesn't just mean taking away our rights. It just doesn't mean taking away our lands. It just doesn't mean defeating us on the field of battle. They actually want us killed. And when you start putting that in the equation, the enemies of France are even more vehement to make sure that France does not succeed. Louis XVI handled himself very well. He made a nice speech before they killed him, saying, "I wish my death would do something good for France, but I foresee things out there that are too vicious." He was probably correct. It's an ugly execution. The king has a thick neck. When the guillotine falls, its weight and its blade are not sufficient to cut the king's head completely off. It goes into his head to a certain distance. The executioner, therefore, has to come up and put his hands on the top of the weight right here. And then he has to push down to make sure the king's head is lost. Louis the 16th dies. This does not help the revolution. It should have been handled differently. Now, that's early in 1793. His wife, Marie Antoinette, is tried later in the year. Her trial, shall we say, Louis XVI's trial, was at least on a semblance, looked like it was a legal proceeding. Technically speaking, you can say the trial of Marie Antoinette also had the trappings of legality. In reality, it was a sham. It was a show. You have the tribunal, you have three men that are going to decide on the execution. They believe anything, bring ridiculous evidence. And they accuse her of everything. The starvation of people in France, wars, subverting the nation. They even accuse her of having physical relations with her son. Talk about sick. When they brought this to her attention, when they accused her of this, she actually appealed to the women in the galleries who were shouting for her blood anyway. She says, "Is this possible?" Well, she's found guilty. She's taken to the guillotine. And she's executed. You see, once again, the revolution is showing its hand. It's going in a certain direction. Well, there are a number of crises that are facing France. The biggest single crisis is not just people like Louis and Marie Antoinette. There are actually armies, enemy armies. Remember, the war initially showed France some success because they grabbed a few lands. When the Austrians and its allies come back and counterattack, pretty soon their armies are on the sacred soil of France. It's really not that far from the borders of Germany to the capital of Paris. As these armies march, you can see that there's a crisis involved. What is going to happen if they're actually able to take Paris? Paris is the biggest city in France. It is also the capital of France. Can we say that France is most vulnerable in Paris? If you take Paris, you pretty well got France. In order to save France, in order to save the revolution, the assembly decides to choose a smaller group of men. You see, if you have to make every decision among men that number up to 700, you're going to have a problem making a rapid decision and getting things on the move rapidly. So they choose a committee of public safety. These are 12 men. You say 12 men certainly are better than several hundred. But you can say, is this a body for rapid decision? Well, if you agree very, very rapidly, you can. The Committee of Public Safety, the most, shall we say, vehement man there, he likes to shout other people down. He tries to take control of every meeting, is Maximilien Robespierre. One of the great brutal men in history. Well, they've got to win the war. How are you going to do this? Let me point out a small issue here. He shows that brutal measures can work. I want us to remember this because we're going to see brutality used in other dictatorships in Europe in the modern time frame. We're going to see this in Nazi Germany. We're going to see this in communist Russia. We're going to see this in fascist Italy, where these kinds of things can work, at least in the short run. You see, you declare an emergency, and the people actually believe there's an emergency. Whoa, let's keep up. We've got to make sacrifices. We've got to work harder. We can give up some of our freedoms in this crisis to protect the nation. I already mentioned in a different context that I was in East Germany in the 1980s before the collapse of the Iron Curtain. Remember, I have money and no place to spend it, so I go into bookstores. You can always buy a book. Very glad to see that. Anyway, I went to one of these bookstores and they had maps on the wall. And they had a very nice map of East Germany. I'm going, okay. And they had on the map the invasion routes where NATO countries, remember West Germany, Holland, Belgium, Britain, France, Canada, among others. The NATO countries are going to be invading East Germany on these roads. They show the highways. One, as I recall, there's one in this direction, going to be attacking in this direction. I'm going, really? Back in the 70s, I worked as an intelligence analyst at the CIA. And one of the things I did was analyze the military capabilities of NATO countries. So I was kind of into this. I'm going, look at that map and I go, we're not planning on invading East Germany. In fact, a lot of times we trying to measure our force capabilities with those of the Warsaw Pact. A lot of times we wonder because they've got us outnumbered. They've got us outnumbered in number of tanks. They got us outnumbered in number of aircraft. Now, I'm not going to say our tanks are bad or our troops are bad, but I'm going to say that we are not planning on invading in any sense East Germany. But you see what they're trying to do. They're trying to foment fear. Are they implying that you can give up your freedoms? Are they implying that during this emergency, we can do without because the external threat is there? Now, let's go back to the French Revolution. Using these kind of ideas. But there is a real threat. That I need to make abundantly clear. There is a real threat. It's not made up. There are forces on the sacred soil of France. Well, you've got to supply an army. You've got to feed an army. You've got to make sure they have enough muskets. You've got to make sure they have enough clothing. You've got to make sure they have proper leadership. He goes in for brutality. You see, the army needs to be fed. You go out to the farms. And you say to the farmers, we will take a certain amount of your grain to feed the army. They try to pay for this, but obviously it's very, very rarely is it actually enough to cover the costs of production. So it's very tempting for many farmers, is it not, to hold a few bags of grain, hide them someplace in the barn, sometimes in the house, where the army, actually they're sending troops out to grab the food. If you get, and they say, we're taking everything, you give them everything. If they find out you are hiding a few things, which you're probably going to sell in the black market later on, if you're hiding something, they'll kill you. I mean, they'll just take you out and bang, and they will kill you. You go to people that are manufacturing, like the people who are making uniforms, and you go to the men who own or hiring other people to do the weaving. And you come to that person and say, we want X number. We want this number of uniforms by this certain date. And if you don't have them, they put you against the wall and they kill you. They shoot you dead. You see, this is not the monetary incentive. This is fear. Oh, by the way, you say, well, what if I can't make it? I'll run. Escape. Where are you going to escape to? You're going to get through the lines? But if you do run, you're considered a traitor to France. And they kill you for that. With this kind of motivation, remember, it works in the short term. With this kind of motivation, the army is being fed, the army is being clothed, and the army has enough weapons, enough muskets to go out and fill the battle. Something else, you need manpower. Since France is a large nation, outside of Russia, it's the largest nation in Europe. Outside of Russia has the largest population. At this time frame, probably well over 30 million people. If you can get large numbers of men in the military, and once again, feed them, clothe them, give them weapons, you can make a big difference on the battlefield. I perhaps shouldn't be using French terms. Nonetheless, this is called the levy en masse, the levy in mass. In other words, you get everybody you can. You round up men. You come to various districts and towns. You take young men, you put them in uniform. If you don't want to go, it can be pretty awful for you. In some cases, these French troops are not as well trained. I mean, you're fighting armies that men go into service virtually as a lifelong career, sometimes 10 or 20 years. You come in as an old man, and if you're still alive in 20 years, you leave the service as an old man. You could be enormously competent in what you're doing. However, the armies of France's enemies tend to use brutality to control their people. You're not going for the loyalty of your men. What you're trying to do is to make your men fear their officers, worse than they fear the enemy. So they will risk their lives in dangerous situations to bring victory. This can be very effective. But there's something else that the French can do, which is really not being done to other countries at this time. You can appeal to their patriotism and their loyalty. Let's go back to the Great Fear. Remember 1789. The peasants, when they're done eating rabbit and pigeons, they start grabbing the land of the nobles. There are areas that were literally off limits to them. The forests, the nobles own the forests, so if you're starving, you can't even go in the forest and gather acorns. You can't go there and trap birds. The deer who live there belong to the landlord. But now in the Great Fear, the peasants are grabbing lands. They're also grabbing areas that, like forests, that had been controlled by the nobility. They're expanding their holdings. They get more land to plow, and they also have more resource they can use. And remember, the majority, shall we say the vast majority, of men that are in the army come from the peasant class. Their families, and sometimes them personally, have actually been getting an awful lot more from the revolution. Would they be motivated, therefore, to keep the revolution going? Would they be motivated, therefore, to fight better? We can make that argument. Also, later on, when Napoleon starts leading the armies of France, he's able to motivate them in similar terms. And we'll mention this later, including plunder and glory. So France has a large army, and it becomes quite effective. It's not a disciplined force where you have everybody acting like automatons. But you do have a force that is capable of doing severe damage to your enemies. And France is able to push back their enemies. Now, something else. How do you motivate the generals, the leaders of the army? The old leaders are from the French upper classes. Some of their families have fled, but some of them have remained in France. They try to maintain their position by serving the state. One of the ways you do this is serving the army. Now, we're going to find examples of men from lower classes who are actually able to move into high levels of the army. This was really impossible before the revolution, but now it has happened. A good example of that is Napoleon. We'll talk about him later. Well, there are times when the French armies are defeated. So what do you do to the leaders? They're arrested. There are times when leaders, the generals, are successful, but not successful enough. There's one famous example of a general who led his men to victory. He got the enemy to retreat, but the enemy did escape. They got away. Well, you've won. The enemy's on the run. But he had been unable to pursue them and destroy that army. So he was arrested and taken back to France and put in prison. He was in prison, with a number of men, also generals, who had either been not successful or not successful, or had been successful, but not successful enough. I mentioned the Marquis de Lafayette. Let me tell you what happened to him. Marquis de Lafayette, military experience, very, very able man. He is placed over the army, one of the armies, that's facing Germany. And when he does this, he finds out that, he has sources. Back in Paris, people like Robespierre are saying, I don't know about this guy. Maybe you ought to arrest him. Before he gave them that opportunity, he decided it's time to get out of France. So actually he snuck away, went over to Germany, where he was put under arrest, where he sat for like 5 years. Later on, under Napoleon, he was able to return to France. He's given no authority. He's essentially a dead letter. They just kind of let him sit out in his villa and do nothing. Because he was so well received in the United States, later on, the Marquis de Lafayette came to the United States, in the 1820s. When he left the United States, there was 13 states. When he came back, there was like 17 states. And when he came back, he visited all the states. Oh, talk about conquering heroes. Oh my goodness. The Americans were just ecstatic to see him, congratulate him, give him parades and honors. To say that Americans are not grateful to the military leaders needs a little bit more of examination, because there's times when we are. Okay, let's go back to France. France has a large army, and they turn back the enemy. So the extreme measures we would think that was used by Robespierre primarily to get things done and to be successful would no longer be necessary. So see, one of the things that Robespierre had unleashed was what we call the terror, or the reign of terror. Can we say it perverts the ideals of the revolution? Equality, justice, freedoms? Absolutely. We do see certain instances where people are in Paris and other areas of France and are viewed as subversive because they don't act properly. You see, all citizens are supposed to be equal in France. So you refer to each other as tu, which is, even in French today, tu means actually that you are addressing a family member or close friend. Vous is more formal. Well, back at this time frame, you refer to noblemen, upper classes, as vous, and your friends as tu. In doing it, actually, the assembly made it illegal to say vous. Now, you might have used vous your entire life, but if you get caught saying vous rather than tu, you can be in big trouble. There are no more noble titles. Everybody is citizen, which means equal. When you push that idea, some people got in trouble if they happen to have, let's say, a book of poetry that has La Fleur de Lis, the symbol of the monarchy of France, on the cover. Wow, you better go through your library and get rid of all those kind of things. You see, they're going to extremes. However, as we examine the reign of terror, what we're seeing is this: more than just grabbing people who say things improperly or have the wrong kind of symbols around their house. We are actually seeing the Jacobins, led by Robespierre, actually going after their political enemies, the people who disagree with them. It gets to be pretty awful. We hear about executions, large numbers of executions. I've read this before. I guess it's true. In some areas of like downtown Paris, we have executioners running the guillotines so rapidly that they're actually competing with each other to see how many people you can kill in a length of time. Whoa. There are guillotines. They're put on carts. and you take them around the various districts of France, not just in Paris, the various cities, various towns, and you pull in and you say, oh, by the way, who do we have that are not supporting the regime? Who is questionable? You take them out and kill them. That's pretty vicious. While the guillotine is the one we remember, in reality, they're killing people in a lot of different manners. One of which is drowning them on the Loire River. At one time, hundreds of men were taken out. They were simply tied up so they couldn't possibly swim. You take them out on the river, you push them off the boat, and they all drown. There are times when you don't have a guillotine handy, it's too cumbersome to drown people. So you get the old firing squad, get men out, line them up, start shooting people. Normally there is normally in society, there's a certain deference paid to women. Women are usually not subject to extreme forms of brutality, not always subject to execution. But after you execute the Queen of France, women are part of the victims as well. How bad did this actually get? There was a time in France, in Paris I should say, where in their zeal to do away with the old traditions, they actually made Christianity, the worship of the following of the faith, being part of the religion, as illegal. In the last days of the terror, they actually made a symbol, I guess it was some woman or something, when I think they had some kind of phony statue on a cart and dragged around, who was the supreme intellectual ideal, rather than having a religious idea of like Mary, the Mother of God, or Jesus Christ. Well, anyway, they made it illegal to worship religion for a time in France, in Paris. And years later, there was a French novelist called Henri de Balzac. And I'm not big into literature. I've read very little French literature, even in translation. But Balzac was always amusing to me. Because, in fact, I used to make a bad joke. I'm really good at bad jokes. Saying, this situation has more characters than a Balzac novel, because you got all kinds of people in there. Well, this is not a novel. This is one of his short stories. It takes place back during the terror. The church that could not be formally recognized. So the church had to go in underground, in other words, basements. And there were a couple of priests, that were actually trying to make sure that people could come and at least give auricular confession, at least confess their sins so they could be cleansed of the sins. Now, in the confessional, a priest is not supposed to know who's giving the confession. Now, these men aren't thick. If you hear the same people coming back in the same voice, there's a tendency for you to get a clue who that might be. One thing perplexes them. There is a man that continues to come back to confess. They're not supposed to know, but they eventually figure out who he is. He is the executioner in Paris. What Balzac is saying in the short story is that it was so vicious during the terror that in this case, the only man in Paris, or perhaps France, had a conscience was the executioner. How many people die during the terror? Many years, you see books, textbooks, 40,000 people died. More recently, I've seen books that, 30,000. Okay, well, if you're looking at the number of people that are actually executed by the guillotine, you can probably substantiate those numbers. But we're missing a big issue here. I mean, there are people that are killed by execution firing squads. And in the Vendée, can I show you where the Vendée is in France? It's a district of France. It had, let's see, images, we probably have villages. The Vendée, as you can see, the Loire River actually comes in about right here. So it's near the mouth. Is that the Loire? Anyway, it's near the mouth. Yeah. a little far south, near the mouth of the Loire River. And there's what, 31 districts of France? There's a lot of districts out here. We believe at this time frame there might have been 750,000 people living there. They're a little bit different than many districts of France because they're actually monarchists. They actually want Louis XVI to succeed in the royal family to continue to ruling France. They don't like what's happening in the revolution, so they rebel. A very careful study done by a French historian states that of these people, about 220,000 of them were killed at this time frame. Whoa, what does that do to 40,000 or 30,000? You see, large numbers make historians nervous. Makes me nervous. I wish I could go back and change the number in a book and suddenly all these people, tens of thousands of people, come to life. Unfortunately, that doesn't happen. I might make myself feel better about it, but let's do our best. Let's look at our best sources. We don't have an adequate number, but if you add up the people that are killed by various means, including being killed in revolts, perhaps a better number, a more reasonable number, would be roughly 600,000 killed. This is not just a little thing that's going on in Paris. This is a really, really big issue. Even though the army is being fed, even though the enemies of France have been pushed back, Robespierre says the terror has to continue. His closest people next to him says, it's over, Robespierre. We don't need this anymore. And he says, no, no, no. You act like the terror is something for just a small time and place. We have to keep the terror going in order to make people happy. Really? Well, he almost gets drunk with his power, and he starts accusing more broadly. Remember, initially we had about 70,000 men. 70. Boy, I'm way off. How about 700 men in the assembly? By the time you get late in the terror, there's like 150 left. I mean, some of these people just decide it's too dangerous. I'm getting out of town. Some of these people had been on the wrong side, shall we say, of Robespierre's political ideology, and some of them had been incarcerated and punished in other manners. Robespierre finally got up, and rather than saying there's a group out there and you have to take care of them, his phraseology was actually like this. It's like he's accusing everybody. So can we call them survivors? The men that are still in the assembly look at each other and going, he's accusing everybody. Finally, they realize they've got to take him down. When they come to arrest him, he tries to cheat them of getting his head cut off. So he pulls out a pistol to blow out his brains. He botches this, actually puts the bullet in his jaw, smashes it. And I don't want to be brutal here, but I hope he was in pain. Anyway, they take him, 1794. Couldn't happen to a more worthy man. They take him, and with the guillotine, they cut his head off. That literally had ended the Reign of Terror. Well, the wars are going on even though France is doing fairly well. Can we say after the Reign of Terror, the assembly, shall we say, brings back in some of the men who had served, shall we say, served in the constructive phase of the revolution? We say more reasonable men. Well, once again, you have 700 men in the assembly. It's still inefficient to use that many men to react to external threats. You have to react rapidly. So rather than having a 12-man council, the Committee of Public Safety, the Assembly chooses a 5-man council, and this is the Directory. Yes, they've got to refer to the Assembly, but we say the Directory rules. The Directory, I said that wrong. Directory rules from roughly 1795 until about December 1799, when Napoleon seizes power. What do we make of the French Revolution? Very important, I think so. Is it a symbol of a change in government and social issues? I think so as well. I've already mentioned a couple of times as a standing warning against the future of the kinds of things that can go wrong in a dictatorship or in a revolution. I was very amused in 1989, the bicentennial of the French Revolution. We saw some books. I read a few of those. Very good studies coming out about the French Revolution. There were magazine articles. The National Geographic, for example, had an entire issue dedicated to the French Revolution. A lot of interesting information that came out at that time. I remember reading a translation, of course, of a French historian who said, why do we make such a big deal over the French Revolution? It's more symbolic than actual. And his argument was this: we shouldn't make such a big deal over it because at the end of the French Revolution, Napoleon comes in, creating a military dictatorship. And now, shall we say, subverts really what the French Revolution was all about. I'm not sure every French historian agrees with that analysis, but it is abundantly clear. You do try to have a representative government, and you end up in a dictatorship. Let's take a look at Napoleon. Napoleon is one of the most significant and well-researched men, individual, if you will, in all of history. One of the reasons why so many people pay attention to him, he's not just important in French history, he's important in many other nations because his armies march into many other countries: Italy, Austria, Poland, Russia, Germany, Spain, to name a few. Even though he does not invade Britain, Britain is at war with him for a very lengthy period of time, literally decades. Therefore, if you happen to be German or Italian or Spanish, you have a real great interest in following or at least studying this man. One book I read on him, which was written 50 years ago, said that at that time there was a vast literature on him. I'm not going to count and see if they're wrong. I'm not going to say, wait a minute, I'll count and see that number's wrong. But anyway, he was estimating that roughly, in numerous languages, there had been at that point about 200,000 books and pamphlets that had been written on Napoleon. Whoa. Napoleon had a vast correspondence. We can read all of that. After he was defeated, he told his story to some men who were with him. And they wrote it down in numerous volumes. Of course, we got people all over Europe, contemporary people making comments and observations. So there's an awful lot of information dealing with him. So you have to know languages, of course, but you can go in and do an awful lot of research on Napoleon. His importance should not be underestimated. His importance is really quite huge. Well, let's take a look at France to give you an idea of where Napoleon comes from. Notice we have the nation of France right here, and there's an island right here, which is Corsica. The language of Corsica is Italian. When Napoleon was born, his father was involved in fighting the French to keep France from dominating Corsica. Now, the Corsicans were not successful. They failed. So France did dominate them. So the Corsica that Napoleon grew up in, at least as a small child, was dominated by France, even though the language and the culture by and large was Italian. Napoleon's first language was Italian, while he had excellent command of the French language. He, as an adult, later on in life, he actually always spoke with an Italian accent. And there were times, particularly in pronouncing large, long French words, he did have a tendency to mispronounce some of them. This is kind of interesting. Let's make another comparison with him and some other important brutal leaders in European history. Hitler, as you know, was not born in Germany, though he leads Germany. He was born in Austria. Now, the Austrians speak different dialects than they do in Germany. It just so happened his father was a customs official. And as a customs official, at one point, the family lived on the borders of Austria. In other words, Passau, which is in Bavaria. Even though Hitler was an Austrian, he actually spoke with a Bavarian accent, not an Austrian accent. But his nationality was Austrian. Another example of this is Joseph Stalin, who's going to be the great dictator of Russia, which we, of course, are going to call the Soviet Union. He was also not a native Russian. He came from Georgia, one of the areas in the mountains down on the borders of Russia. He was part of Russia, but he was not ethnically a Russian. And he did mispronounce words, and he spoke with a Georgian accent his entire life. I don't know if this is significant in any sense whatsoever, but some of the great and brutal men of the modern world lead countries where their actually origin is somewhat different. You will find in looking at the history and the biographies of Napoleon, he is widely positively received in many circles. He has his critics. He has his admirers. Can we say that in all honesty, perhaps he has more admirers than he does detractors? I'm not one of these fans. In all fairness to Napoleon, I do want to say that there's certain a level of progress was achieved. But I'm going to argue the cost was enormous in human lives, human suffering, and physical destruction. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. Images. There's a painter in France called David. What's his first name? Jacques-Louis David? Any event, he was an important court painter. And a lot of the more impressive portraits of him were done by David. One of his more famous portraits is in the National Gallery of Art. And I would like to show it to you. This is actually it, but I'd like to show you the full length of it. Here's Napoleon as a young man. This is full length. This is what is the National Gallery of Art. And it's quite fun. I'm not a great art critic, but the detail, the kinds of things we're seeing right here is really quite impressive. Well, we have one of the important men in history. Let's look at his background. He is Italian. He's a Corsican. And however, since Corsica is part of France, he's sent to a school in France as a young boy. Was he abused as a child? We're not terribly sure. Can we say that as far as we know, his upbringing was not different than his siblings? Wouldn't necessarily be different than any other boy that was sent away to a military school in France. Commonly done, if you want to move the family up. And though his family had some noble connections, they're not great nobility. One of the ways you can get employment in the family is get in the military. If you have proper training, you can be an officer. Now, since he's not heavily connected in the high levels of the French court, you would assume that he'd never achieve a high level of being an officer. But, a lieutenant, a captain, maybe even a major would be within his reach if he's properly trained. About the only thing I can look at where he might have been treated poorly was his family didn't care an awful lot for him. You see, when he's at these military schools in France, you do that when there's vacations like at Christmas time. you can send these people home. And his mother doesn't even worry enough about him to allow him to go home. Well, that can hurt your feelings. Is that going to make you understand his mentality or his psychological prowess? That's hard to make that discussion. Is he different in any real respect from the other boys? He has people have a tendency to call him short. Now, it does depend which book you read. I've read one book that was 5 foot even, 5 foot flat. I've read a book that was 5'1". I read a book that was 5'5". I find this quite amusing because didn't they ever measure him during his lifetime? And people say, well, there's different kinds of inches that they were using that time frame. Well, why didn't you use it in metric? Can we say that no matter which number we choose, that in reality, he's considered short for his time frame? I don't think that was detrimental to him at all. Going back and comparing with other dictators, Hitler was what, 5'9"? However, I think that for his generation, Stalin was like 5'4", so he's fairly short. Is there a connection here? I don't think so. Is he treated differently by the boys? Probably not. We do read this, that as a young boy, and of course, you know, boys will be boys, you're out in the courtyard and you have a snowball fight. Whap. A lot of fun. But Napoleon had to lead. He led out at all times. That may be true. It also might be reading history backwards. We want him to be a leader all the time, so why didn't he lead when he was a child? He does have a fixation on artillery. He absolutely loves cannon. In his notebooks as a student, he would very carefully draw cannon. Cannon can be singular, can also be plural. Maybe I should call it cannons. He drew artillery pieces very meticulously, and he's trying to make sure that he understands very well their abilities. There are a number of sayings we call Napoleon's maxims. One of the more famous is God is on the side, talking about battle. God is on the side of the heaviest artillery. Now, coming from an artilleryman, this would probably be pretty understandable. Well, he gets through school. He's a low officer, he's like a lieutenant, like a captain. At one time, even at the beginning of the French Revolution, he views that his possibility, the possibility of him working up to high position, is just not there. You can't do this. So he actually contemplates suicide, did not kill himself. Well, during the Revolution, he is an artillery captain at a city called Toulon. Toulon is way down in southern France. And we see this during the Revolution, that there are, in effect, riots. We hear about the mob in Paris, yes. We hear about the mob coming out and tearing people to shreds and storming the Bastille. But there are similar things actually going on in other places. At one time at Toulon, I believe this was a bread riot. People are hungry, and they're trying to come in and grab food. In doing this, if you want to keep civic order, it's a pretty good idea if you can disperse the crowd. So Napoleon has his artillery in the streets, open fire on a crowd. Now, this can be old men, young boys, women, and children. A cannonball, depending on which size he was using, a 6-pound cannonball weighs 6 pounds. Some of the larger artillery used during the time frame would be larger than that, 9, even sometimes 12 pounds. You take an item like that, and it's going 600 feet per second, or sometimes if you put a large charge in, it's 1,000 feet per second. If that hits a human being, it can be devastating. I mean, you blow people's heads off, blow people's arms off, eviscerate them, almost blow them in half in one artillery blast. This can be ugly. Blood everywhere, people crying, mayhem. And Napoleon brags about this. Here are direct quotes from him. "We killed a great many of them. I could not be happier." Could you not, if you have any moral sense, look at that and analyze it differently? It's more heroic. It's more heroic. It's more devastating. It's more brutal. There are a lot of people that would witness that kind of thing and be sick to their stomach. There'd be a lot of people witness that kind of thing and say, I never want to see that again. It's not Napoleon. He has, because of his success in putting down mobs, which makes the Directory very happy because they would like to have civic order. If you can take the mob out of the political matrix, then you can rule much more effectively. This kind of thing would have been impossible during the monarchy. But you take a man with little experience. Yes, he goes from a captain being a major. And of course, you've got to have political connections. There are people that are talking about him in Paris. The pamphlets, newspapers give him fairly good press. And shockingly, very surprisingly, the Directory makes him a general and sends him to the borders of France. Now, the most serious fighting is going on. You can go to France right here, 1792. This is before we have a large number of expansions and borders change quite dramatically. Well, I talked about the various districts of France. There's a lot of them. Which is the one that would help us the best? Maybe this might help us better to understand what's happening at that point. The borders of France, traditional borders of France. Now, the important generals are fighting in more important areas. That would be up here, be in Germany, because Austria and her allies have armies that are facing France up here. So sending Napoleon down here, you're up in the Alps, and it's cold and there's snow. This is not, you're not sending your best general. You're sending what they consider to be, shall we say, an inferior general to take over command right here. This guy's a young man. He's in his 20s. And he's showing up. And of course, his military experience in shooting down people in the streets is not extensive. So he shows up. You would think the other generals, and they did. They said, oh, this kid, we'll be able to push him around, manipulate him. Napoleon won't stand for that. He comes in and says, when I give an order, I want it to be obeyed. I want it to be obeyed without question. If you do not follow my orders, I'll have you shot. He said it and he meant it. So the other generals are not in a position to either subvert him or to try to control him. He's up in the mountains. It's cold. It's snowy. There's mud. Now, normally someone would just simply write back to France. And the generals up here are doing this. They're writing back to Paris and saying, look, I need more food. I need better equipment. I need more blankets, these kind of things. Rather than begging for reinforcements and better equipment, Napoleon tells his men, let's go into the valleys down here. If you want to compare the cold of the Alps with the lower valleys that are warmer and drier down in Italy, that can be an inducement. One of the things one of the things Napoleon realizes that a lot of people do not is the issue of praising your men. Now remember, a lot of these men are from the levy en masse. A lot of these are peasants. Napoleon wants to give medals for valor to people. He wants to give ribbons to them for participation in campaigns that you can wear on your uniforms. Some people this time say, look, these are men. These aren't children. Can you really motivate them with these childish trinkets? Well, you can. When I was in the Navy, you have your name tag on the right over here. On the left, you have your ribbons. I wasn't in very long, so I only ended up like 3 ribbons. One was a marksmanship ribbon. We went out shooting pistols at the gun range, and so I got something there. I can't remember the other 2 or 4, actually. See, I didn't take an awful lot of pride in that. But there were some men who had been around for a long time. Some of these guys had actually served during the Vietnam War. And they've got a rack over here. If you ever want to have a good conversation with some of these men, sit down and say, oh, what does that mean? It's really good. Well, this means this, and I was here, and my unit accomplished this. Wow, Napoleon's actually correct. Napoleon is very good at understanding his men. Campaign ribbons, helpful. He's also going to be able to tell them that you go into Italy, not only is it warmer down there and you have better food, in reality, you can go down there and, well, he allows plundering to take place. So in a successful military campaign, some of these men end up with a lot of money. He has success. The other generals can't even move. And Napoleon marches his armies down into Italy. He outmaneuvers his enemies. And in outmaneuvering his enemies, he tends to beat them. Now, to say he's always high-minded, and sometimes he is. Sometimes when he invades countries, he tries to free the serfs and offer them freedoms. But there's an aspect of brutality, which is very apparent also in his campaigns. There are times when he has prisoners of war shot. I'm going to mention that again when we talk about Egypt. There are times when the enemy is just trying to get away, and rather than allowing them to escape, he has his artillery open up on them, blow them to smithereens, and kill people needlessly, something that didn't have to be done. In some of the smaller towns and villages of Italy, there's actually some resistance. Somebody has a musket, takes a shot at the French troops. Napoleon wants to stop this kind of thing from happening. So he surrounds the village and has all the men in the village, sometimes the older boys as well, taken out and shot. When this happens by the Germans in 1914, when they're invading Belgium, shooting groups of people under the suspicion that some of them were resisting or taking a shot at troops, that's a war crime. But time and again, we see that when Napoleon does exactly the same kinds of things, they are viewed differently by historians. Well, it's part of what he does, and that's part of the glory of the man. But he is a brutal person. Well, he goes down into Italy. He is successful. Surprise, surprise, people are shocked by this. He drives the Austrian armies back. He takes various areas, and he allows plunder to take place. This is not the only time Napoleon is going to be in Italy. But he's going to come back. However, in allowing plunder, he's going to bring a lot of important historical artifacts, artwork, back to France. I mentioned to you earlier when we were talking about the Renaissance. Remember I showed you the Mona Lisa, and I told you it was in the Louvre in Paris. The reason why it was in the Louvre in Paris is that Leonardo died in France. His last years, the King of France, Francis I, was very impressed with his artwork, invited him to come and live in France in his last years, and literally took care of him. And this painting, Leonardo had packed with him. And so when he died, the King of France takes it over and eventually ends up in a museum in France. However, there's a lot of artifacts, not just that are in the Louvre in Paris that come from the Italian Renaissance. You say, well, how did they get there? Some of them got there because of plundering of Napoleon's armies in Italy. I would imagine, in fact, I'm quite sure, that Italy would like to have those things back in Italy. Of course, the French say, I'm sorry, they're here. They're going to remain here as well. So Napoleon now has gained a great reputation. And he decides, well, let me talk a little bit about his personality. Before he ever had this great fame, he married a woman by the name of Josephine. Josephine had been married before, so she had a couple of children. While we think that Napoleon, by his generation, was somewhat short, Josephine was probably only 5 foot even, so she was short by her generation as well. He's enamored with her. She doesn't think much of him. I mean, a marriage of convenience is probably the best way of looking at this. While he's on campaign in Italy, down in here, he writes to her almost continuously, saying, come and join me, come and be with me. At exactly the same time, her latest boyfriend is a man named Charles. We would pronounce in French, call him Charles. Charles and he and she are hoochie-cooing up in some resort areas, largely close to modern-day Switzerland. I mean, does she really think that she married him for love? Not a marriage of convenience, at least as far as she's concerned, at least initially. Can we say she has a roving eye? She likes men, and she likes a lot of men. Well, we'll come back and talk about Napoleon's relationship with women later on. Let's go on and continue to talk about his campaigns. Success in Italy. One of the things we can say about Napoleon is he tends to be grandiose. Some people will go on to go so far as to say this man has delusions of grandeur. He actually sits down with maps, sometimes of Europe and sometimes broader areas, to figure out how to defeat his enemies. His biggest, I shouldn't call him biggest single enemy, but one of his more tenacious enemies happens to be Britain. How can you get at Britain? Well, when he's emperor later on, he says, goodness gracious, if I can just figure out a way of getting across the English Channel, it's only about, 18 miles across from the Pas de Calais to the cliffs of Dover. If he can just get his army across there and get his army on British soil, he can take care of these people. He's probably right, but how are you going to get across? As long as Britain controls the seas with an excellent navy, you're not going to get across. I don't think this was ever really practical, but he actually thought about, let's dig a tunnel underneath the English Channel. With the technical expertise that's available at that time frame, it probably could not be done. I believe it was in the 1990s when we called the channel. There's actually a tunnel. It is usually used with trains, but I think you can drive cars through there as well. That actually now does go under the English Channel. At the time frame, this is ridiculous. But wait a minute. If he can't get at Britain directly, why not get at them indirectly? Can he hurt their interests? So he decides to invade Egypt. Let's get Napoleon in Egypt. I'm looking for a map, and I'm getting a representation. Yeah, let's try another route. Napoleon. Map. I would like to have something that's a little bit better, a little bit broader for the Mediterranean. Well, Britain has an empire. It is a very large empire. And they have an extremely large holdings in India. And India brings them a lot of wealth. I'll mention this later when we're talking about imperialism. One of the ways you get wealth from India is by taking ships across the Indian Ocean. And you put the goods and services on caravans and take them over to the Mediterranean. Well, maybe this is the best one right here. This Eastern Mediterranean, Britain's up here. If you want to take goods and services from India, you got to go all the way around Africa, or you can simply bring them up like to the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf, and then transport these goods and services over land and get in the Mediterranean and take them back to Britain. Napoleon believes if he can cut this off. Oh, by the way, the Suez Canal does not exist yet. It was actually built by the French in the 1860s. So you still have to get these things off of boats in one place and put them on boats in another place. Napoleon believes that if he can take an army down here and he can control the Middle East, he can cut off Britain from this important source of income, finances, and hurt them economically and maybe eventually bring them to terms. So he takes an army down to Egypt, a French army across the Mediterranean. He brings scientists with him. Rather than just being an invasion of a military force, he brings scientists with them. He brings artists with them. Our understanding of Egypt is not that strong. It has great reputation. People go down there to see the pyramids. And he brings artists down with them. They copy manuscripts, wrong term. They copy the writing that were placed on stones. They copy down the representations, if you will, of various temples and shrines. Unfortunately, the years have not been kind to Egypt. There have been times when some of these artifacts that were available to view in 1798 are no longer there. They're gone. Years after Napoleon had left Egypt, these books were published in very, very large folio manuscripts in multiple volumes. Egyptologists to this day find them very, very helpful, because without these, a lot of this information would not be available. One of the more famous discoveries he and his men made is the Rosetta Stone. One of the reasons why it's so famous is it was found in Rosetta, Egypt. And the Rosetta Stone, which is in the British Museum in London to this day, I have seen it, is spectacular for one main reason. There's different forms of writing here. There's hieroglyphics. I believe the other shortened form of hieroglyphics is Demotic, and has Greek. Scholars can read Greek, but they can't read Demotic and hieroglyphics. When copies of this was brought back, I don't know how Britain ended up getting a hold of it. When it was brought back to France, of course, copies of it were made. And scholars were able to take this, my name is Champollion, to take names down here and look at what we call cartouche. Usually it's a circle that goes around a number of characters. And able to say maybe this name here corresponds with these symbols up here. And in doing that, you can break down a few symbols. It takes a while. It's not easy to do. But they're able to break these down, and eventually, now Egyptologists can read hieroglyphics. It's one of the, shall we say, accidental things that happened during the invasion. Well, what happens down here? Can I go back to my map? Eastern Mediterranean. Napoleon is able to take this area. He comes in, this is a very hot area, as you know. Commonly, the temperatures in the afternoon can go up to 110. Sometimes they can go up higher than that. He brings men wearing wool uniforms. He's also not very good in bringing enough canteens for the men. So the men are marching around, sometimes suffering egregiously because of their hot uniforms and also because of lack of water. However, he fights the local Mamelukes. These are the local rulers in Egypt that time frame. And he's victorious. He drives them away, so he controls a lot of the area down here. In order to cut off everything entirely, he tries to march up through Palestine, up in this direction, to make sure the British can't move their goods and services by other routes. He goes into Palestine, you and I call it Israel. He lays siege to Acre, does not take this, not successfully take it. He finally realizes he's overextended. And he finally decides, well, I'll just turn around and come back. So he turns around and comes back. In the meantime, Admiral Nelson of the British Navy has come down here with his navy and sunk the French fleet, just literally slaughtered them. So now his army is now isolated in Egypt. And what can he do? Well, he simply abandons his men to their fate. Many of these men are going to die. Many of these men are going to end up being prisoners. The ones who actually do survive and make their way back to France much later are few in numbers. And of course, they don't think very much of Napoleon abandoning them to their fate. Napoleon actually is able to sneak back into France. In a military coup, November 9th, 1799, he takes the military down to Paris, he dismisses the Directory, and he takes power. He's not voted in, he takes power. The whole ideas, his bitter problems with being down here in Egypt. I mean, when he kills his enemies, sometimes he has them murdered on the banks of the Niles and simply thrown in the river. He has one of the wives of his generals, probably a fairly attractive young lady. He demands that she be his mistress, and she is. In the meantime, Josephine is back in France sleeping with the guys. Of course, he's going to find out about this. And when he does, he pushes Josephine away. Oh, she comes to the door, and she pounds on the doors, and she cries outside, oh, please forgive me. And he does. However, Josephine knows that she's married now to somebody who's very important, and she's going to watch her conduct after this time frame. Well, he takes power. There are, I believe, it's like 3 different times when Napoleon actually turned to the people of France to justify what he has done. In other words, I believe they vote for a new constitution. They vote to make him emperor and emperor for life. Any event, the first vote is actually to support his takeover of the government. And the new constitution is actually this. You will vote that I have taken over the government. That's a legitimate thing that I did. And therefore, I have done this with your blessing. In an instance, shall we say, of some of the greatest voter fraud, election fraud in the history of France. Napoleon states that in the election, 3 million voters, remember these are men, they're usually 25 years and over. They do have a tendency to have a little bit more wealth than other people. So we say 3 million is largely, if 3 million people actually did vote in this, that's largely 1/10 of the entire population. So a lot better than just having an aristocracy involved. But this is not a free election, as you and I would talk about. Well, he claims that 3 million people voted for his takeover, for this new constitution, and only 1,500, 1,500 voted against. My goodness. Can we say this is a statistical impossibility? 1,500 people voted against? I mean, if you're giving this verbally, there'd be well more men than that who meant to vote for Napoleon who said something wrong. In reality, historians have tried to examine what was actually happened, and this is pretty much what we see. In actuality, about 1.5 million voted for Napoleon, while about 3.5 million voted against. This is enormous voter fraud. Rather than saying he absolutely had everybody on his side, he's disastrously defeated in the polls. Doesn't matter to him. He can present his popularity as fiction rather than as fact. Sometimes we say his greatest achievement is the Code Napoleon. Yeah, we tend to put his name on it. He is influential in what's going on. In reality, the French had been working on revising their legal code ever since the beginning of the French Revolution. There is, I mean, the jurisprudence of France goes back hundreds of years. Could you imagine the number of court cases over that time, the number of decisions that have been made, the number of traditions that have been kept alive, the number of laws that had been passed? You're going to take all of that and codify it down into a simpler system. Of course, that takes a long time. However, it's been more than a decade. However, by the time you get to Napoleon, this simplified law code is largely ready for use and for publication. I'm going to say Napoleon was somewhat involved in it, at least in various principles. This man had a phenomenal mind. I really have a hard time coming to grips with a man that brilliant. A lot of things are going on. Politics are going on. Military is going on. In this case, the legal system is going on. He has ministers coming and talking to him. People can come and discuss an issue with him. And someone will come in and Napoleon will change the point of discussion over to talk to this other man. Sometimes that happens with more than one person. Sometimes it might be two. So you have person A, person B, person C. And he talks to them about various issues. And then almost like not missing a step, almost back exactly to where you were in the conversation. He flips back to actually where they were before, and he can continue. I can't balance a checkbook. I can't make a coherent lecture, because if my mind wanders, I'm lost. And look at this guy. He has real gifts. There's no doubt about this at all. Let's go back to the Code Napoleon. In the Code Napoleon, he does alter it somewhat, the statements here. And can we say this is his greatest achievement? Because as he not only is the Napoleonic Code, which he does not author, but he does spread, it encompasses France. But as he marches in various areas, other countries as well, he comes in, he tries to get support, he often frees the serfs, he introduces the metric system when he can, and he brings in his law code, which a lot of people like quite a bit. Its similarities to Roman law are obvious. Let's see if I can just give you some example of it. Oh, by the way, when he does push this out, the assembly, which Napoleon allows to exist, the assembly exists kind of a debating society. It's a deference to the people who want to believe they have their say in government, so you can vote for your representatives. They go to the assembly and where they have virtually no power. However, the assembly, using a lot of guts in this case, said that they condemned the code as a betrayal of the revolution, because the freedoms that had been guaranteed during the revolution were somewhat abrogated. He returns the tyranny of the husband over the wife. The husband has great authority. Now, during the French Revolution, the women actually got more rights. They're never equal with men. Napoleon says, women are worthless. I'll talk more about that in a minute. And let's see what I have here. In disputes, I don't have it up here, so let me explain it. In any kind of possible dispute between an employer and a workers' group, workers' organization, the employer is virtually automatically correct. Therefore, workers do have a tendency to have much less say in the nature of their lives. Now, if you're an upper class person, you go, whoa, this is very helpful. If you're a male chauvinist, you take a look at my authority now is complete over the wife. Sometimes you can divorce the wife at your will and she can't do that to you. Sometimes the father of the house can control the lives of the children, can keep boys married till they're 25 or something, can keep girls married until they're 21. So if you're a male chauvinist and you believe that men ought to be on top of the situation, in reality, this is pretty good law. It's efficient in the terms of you do not have the jury system in this. One of the issues we have in English common law, which is over in Britain and in the United States, it becomes cumbersome because you've got to choose jurors. And when you choose jurors, they can, sometimes they're intelligent, sometimes they're well-read, sometimes they're not. The lengthy process, and you have to come with a unanimous decision. Napoleon doesn't invent the tribunal, the three-man judge. Remember, there was a tribunal that condemned Marie Antoinette to death. But in using three, you do have a tendency to have people that know the law, are more efficient. They're not really the impartial. In the English system, you actually have the judge is supposed to be largely impartial. In reality, in the Napoleonic system, the judge is actively involved in the investigation to get at the truth. The reason why you have three, sometimes one, you have to have an odd number, so you can't be deadlocked. You can't have two judges voting one direction, two in another. No, you have two voting in one direction and one in another. Therefore, the majority is going to win. It's efficient. It is also easier to be controlled by the state. The jury system is not easy to control. The judges are appointed by the state. If you want to use them in this manner, to have people in control of your nation, you get your men in the judgeships and they control things. By the English system, this leaves a lot to be desired. But once again, if you want power in the upper classes, power in the state, this works fairly well. Well, something else we can talk about Napoleon here, and that is in Hispaniola, which we now call Haiti, some of the islands of the Caribbean, there was a successful slave revolt. This is very unusual in history. It might be the only successful slave revolt in modern history. About the only successful slave revolt we know of in the ancient history is when the Hebrews left Egypt and went into the wilderness to worship their Lord, and eventually ended up in Palestine. Very unusual. Well, down there at that time frame, something like 90% of the population were slaves. If you lose control of those people, you got a big problem. So not only have they kicked out the French, they've established their own form of government and they have their own people ruling at that time frame. I'm stunned by this. Unfortunately, it was very brutal. When they did capture their former masters, they were often executed in very unpleasant manners. A lot of slaughter. But they are free. Napoleon didn't like this. So he sent forces back down to these islands. Yeah, they're better organized, better weapons, and they're able to restore slavery in 1802. Once again, to call him high-minded in all respects leaves a lot to be desired. Let's go down to religion to support the regime. The belief system that Napoleon had, his personal belief system, is largely one of the skeptics. He's nominally Catholic. He was baptized as a baby. He doesn't really support the faith. He doesn't go to confessional. Doesn't spend time at Mass to speak of. But he looks at religion as one of the great devices, mechanisms, institutions can control people's minds. See, the state can control you as far as your actions are concerned, but religion can control your conscience to make the support of the government, the support of Napoleon, a matter of conscience. So he tries to subvert the church. Religion is useful for the government of every country. To quote Napoleon, let's go back, we must use it to control the people. How can you do this? There's a lot of authority in the church. The church didn't do well during the French Revolution, as I've already mentioned. They're trying to hold on to what they have. Well, if you're giving them money and sometimes using coercion, can you get the church to, shall we say, alter a little bit what you're doing? The children are taught in the religious schools, also in the public schools. The children are taught that to honor the emperor is to honor God himself. It is up to you as a religious person. It's up to you to have the support of the Lord, and you get the support of the Lord by supporting the state and the emperor. The children are told if they should fail in, I'm way off here. Get over here. If they should fail in their, next page, I'll get down to it, in their duties to the emperor, They would be resisting the order established by God. Kind of same thing we were saying before. To honor the emperor is to honor God. And would make themselves deserving of eternal damnation. I'm not sure we can prove exactly how far a lot of people took this. But if you teach young people certain things when they're young, they do have a tendency to accept them. Can we say, the least I can say about this is very high-handed, manipulative, and disruptive of religion. I've already mentioned that Josephine, at least early in their marriage, wrapped Napoleon around his little finger, her little finger. Cheating on him, of course, if he cheats, that doesn't matter. Right? Who cares about that? But if she cheats, all of this is a big deal. And he does cheat. Not just before Josephine is pounding on his door, please forgive me, but later on when he's on campaigns as well. He degrades women. What has he got against women? Here's one of the direct quotes from Napoleon. We have treated women too well. Can we go back to the Napoleonic Law Code? We do emphasize control of women. This is consistent with that, is it not? We have treated women too well. And in this way have spoiled everything. What's everything? Social, political? I don't know. Everything is a pretty broad term. Can you say everything is everything and excludes nothing? We have treated women too well and in this way have spoiled everything. We have done every wrong in raising them to our level. The wife should be the actual, oh my goodness, there we go. Well, you get too clever and you go too far. Let me get back. The wife should be the actual property of the husband. In fact, nature has made women our slaves. This isn't just theoretical, it's personal. I mean, he likes to insult women. He likes to run them down. When he meets, of course, he has these spies telling him all kinds of things. He loves in public, like at dinner or something, to tell women about the dalliances of their husbands, who they're cheating with, to just chagrin these women. He makes them admit their age. Isn't that a little ungauche? Isn't that a little uncool? You know, women, particularly women when they reach middle age, do they not want to look like they're younger than they are? Fashion, cosmetics play into this. Why humiliate them? Tell me your age. Got to know your age. Of course, if they fudge, he corrects them. What do you get out of this? As I mentioned, he cheats. One of the more famous instances, when he was in Poland, I believe it's like 1807. He's over there and his eye fell on a 15-year-old girl. Likes young women. And he wants her brought to his bed. Of course, she's not interested. But he tells the Poles, look, if she's not brought to my bed, I've got an army here, and I can make it very uncomfortable for you. I guess doing her civic duty, she's brought to his bed. There are willing women. Why does he have to force women that are unwilling? Okay. One of the aspects of the French Revolution, one of the aspects of Enlightenment is free expression. You need to have the ability to express your ideas. Pamphlets, books, and newspapers. Newspapers are very popular. In Paris, for example, there's 73 newspapers. They have people, obviously they're competing, they're trying to get the best stories, they're trying to get them out rapidly, ideas are flowing around, the bigger percentage of Frenchmen can read, people can read them to you as well. This is a brilliant example of the flow of ideas. Napoleon has them cut back, destroyed, one after another. So we start out with roughly 73 newspapers in Paris. Over a period of years, that number is pared down to 4 newspapers. And these foreign newspapers are propaganda organs. This is not free expression. This is not new ideas. This is not another way of looking at what's happening. These are propaganda organs to support the bottom line. Napoleon at times tells the newspapers directly what they're going to publish. Even when he's far away on campaigns, when it takes sometimes weeks for letters to get back to Paris, Napoleon will write or dictate various battle accounts, and he's always successful. Even when he's pushed back and he has problems, it's always successful. Napoleon is doing great things, trying to control everything that the Parisians and other newspapers in France know about him. Free expression is not part of his regime. Joseph Fouché. Fouché is remembered during the brutal phase of the revolution as the Butcher of Lyon. Lyon, city in France. Lyon young man, oh, well, crossing the Alps, glorious. Okay, well, I guess I lost Napoleon as a more elderly man. Let's go back here and, shall we say, getting closer to middle age. All right, now, he has, I would call him a henchman, head of the secret police, the Butcher of Lyon. In Lyon, a city in France. What Fouché is trying to do is to eradicate anybody who might resist the revolution, the Committee of Public Safety, the regime. In doing so, he does attack people of various religious and social standing. He has his executioners drag people out day after day. He kills women who are having affairs with upper class men. He kills people who are over production of various materials, simply to make sure that the others are inspired, that they will produce better. He executes nuns who refuse to quit praying. He executes people that are involved in religious activities. I mean, he goes too far by any stretch. There's so much blood and gore at the execution sites. They apparently don't clean them up after a series of executions. So the dogs, the roaming dogs in the street, come and lick them up. This is a very brutal man. And when he goes back in the evening after doing his deviltry of that day, he acts like he's a good family man. He's a very good man, at least Napoleon thinks so, to control the secret police. The secret police has been around for a while. Remember, we mentioned them when we were talking about Louis XIV. Can we say, however, that Fouché's secret police is more brutal than what had gone on before? A large number of people are hired. They intercept letters. They take the letters and read them. If there's something in there improper, or they think might be improper, or something's written in code, so it's hard for them to read, you can be in big trouble. Constant surveillance or watching people. Some of this is simple intimidation. Some of this is grabbing people to see if they might know something. The interrogations can be severe. Physical pain can be inflicted. He goes so far as to say this, that people in France can be arrested for improper thoughts. Well, how on earth do you possibly know what somebody is thinking? There's no way for you to know this. So what? It's just suspicion. I don't like your face. Good enough. Above everything else that Napoleon does, we remember him as a military leader. Napoleon makes wars, takes money, drafts men. He just absolutely loves war. Well, military is very expensive. When you conquer an area and you can plunder it, you can get gold and other precious items that can help support the army. But more often than not, you've got to tax people. Now, remember, he is high-minded, and I'm going to use an example of Switzerland. He marches into the Swiss Republic at this time frame. He marches in, we call it the Swiss Confederation. He marches in, and the vestiges of having men in noble positions controlling society, that's all thrown out. All those guys are gone. He disarms the Swiss army. They try to fight in defense of their country without much impact. In fact, they're beaten very easily. He does free the people. He's introducing reforms. But one of the first things he does is go into every state and take their treasury to support the army. There are men who do support the army by joining. This is true of Germany, it's true of Switzerland, it's true of many countries. But many men are drafted. They're forced to go in. As the wars go longer and the cost of life is more severe, it becomes more and more challenging for Napoleon to get men to volunteer. The draft becomes more common. Many men are taken in and never come back. He's so cavalier about the loss of life that when sometimes tens of thousands of men are killed, he says, oh, one good weekend in Paris will make up for the difference. I guess the French back then, as now, do have a reputation for being, shall we say, friendly. Well, Europe destroyed, literally from Lisbon to Moscow. Millions dead. We usually count up, saying about 3 million died. And cities destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of women raped. Heavy destruction to accomplish what? Napoleon quotes, war justifies everything. Nothing can be established except by the sword. There's joy in danger. I've committed to battles that would decide the fates of many among us. And my eyes remained dry. Let me get down here. The whole army, and I felt no emotions. I'd watched the execution maneuvers bound to cost the lives of many among us, and my eyes remained dry. He feels nothing, no matter how the loss. One of the ways he's trying to defeat Britain is to hurt them economically. He sets that the continental system, which is a boycott, he orders all the nations in Europe, including France, Germany, and Russia actually cooperates as far as boycotting British goods. The idea is to bring them down economically. If he brings them down economically, then he can destroy the state. It does hurt Britain economically, but in reality, the manufactured goods, primarily cloth, is that Napoleon needs for his armies, he's actually got from the British. He's hurt Europe economically. He has not hurt Britain enough. So now we've got a different problem. It backfires. One of the things oh my goodness, I was supposed to get through this lecture on Napoleon today. I'm not going to make it. In fact, I'm out of time. Oh, I'm sorry. I guess I get connecting too much run off the mouth, say more than I probably need to say. Please excuse me, I do apologize for that. However, I'm not quite through with Napoleon. In our next lecture, I want to finish with Napoleon. You see, we do have a few issues down here. When I'm through with Napoleon, then I want to shift to a discussion of later time frames. Unfortunately, we're going to have to do that. I'm going to have to pick up these pieces later on. In the meantime, wherever you are, enjoy yourself. Please come back next time. I will finish with Napoleon, and then I'll go on. Goodbye.